I think everybody is in, looks like. Hi, everyone. And we're live on Facebook, and we're recording, so I think we're good. Welcome back. I know we weren't here in August. I hope you all missed us. We missed you guys. And today we're doing our third in Desi's series of plant lore by the season, and she's doing autumn. So we're going to get started in just a minute. I just want to tell you a little bit about Desi. She, just a second. Oh. Well, all right. I've lost my thing. So I'm going to tell you from here. Desi is a historian with passionate interest in the medical, culinary, and gardening knowledge from America's and England's past. Desiree has a degree in history from UNC Greensboro and a degree in baking and pastry from Johnson & Wales, Charlotte. After 16 years of study, she is always happy to learn new information, experiment in her garden, and try out traditional recipes in her kitchen or fire pit. And we are fortunate enough today to have her share more of her wisdom and knowledge and sense of humor with us. So Desi, whenever you're ready, go ahead and take it away.
All right, well, thank you all for joining me today. This is going to be the third installment of our talk on plant lore, and we're talking about autumn, which I think is a lot of folks' favorite time of the year, and perhaps mine. I will say that it's my favorite season. I get excited. I know we're still in hurricane season, so it can be a bit nerve-wracking at times, but there's that subtle shift in the daylight that you may have started noticing. We had a slight cool trend this weekend, so we'll get those coming every once in a while. And even the plants are starting to change up. Some that might have been very bright, vibrant during the summertime are starting to pull back. Others are getting ready to go into full bloom or full show because autumn is really the time of the year that they're going to be at their height. Now, with the past talks and with this one, I'm focusing mainly on agrarian society. So these are going to be the folks living in your rural settings. I'm not saying that a lot of what I'll be talking about you don't also see occurring with folks that live in the cities. It's just most of my knowledge is based on people living in the country in smaller communities. That said, just because you lived a rural life and in a small community, it did not mean you may not have had the same access to items as those in the cities. Trade routes are early on established in this country, so it may take you a little longer to get some of these items that may not be native or easy to grow in your garden, but it wasn't necessarily something you were never going to have. Now, with when does fall officially start? This year in 2021, we're saying September the 22nd is the start of fall. If you're going to go with the Gregorian calendar and temps, you're going to say September 1st. When it comes to that most particular moon people think of with fall, the harvest moon, it depends on how close that full moon is to the fall equinox, whether it's a harvest moon or not. So it could fall in the month of September, or it could fall in the month of October. It just depends. Now, the harvest moon is a very important moon because it's giving you just a little extra light at night for you to pull in the last bit of your crops before the first frost comes in. So that's one reason in modern lore today we still know of that moon, is because up until this country really stopped being mainly an agrarian country, it was a very important moon for people, especially pre-electricity. And before I go too much into the moon lore talk, that's something I want to mention. We're going into the darker times of the year. In fact, that started back in the summer solstice when our daylight started to wane. People did not have electricity. You live out in the country. Even today, if you live out in the country and there's not a lot of street lights, it can get pretty dark at night. And so this was the time of the year where you see people talking more and more about things that might go bump in the night and cause some chills. So we will start out kind of more traditional plant lore talk, and as I continue in, we're going to go more into the realm of things we associate with Halloween. I was explaining to Liz earlier, this talk of kind of your darker folklore is actually not going to end with the fall talk. It's going to continue into my winter talk, because Christmas time could also be seen as a somewhat scary time of the year because you have the winter solstice, and we'll get into that a little later with that talk. Now, if you are worried about witches and ghosts and goblins and such, I've got you covered. Later on, I'm going to talk about some of the things you would have seen people doing traditionally to keep these creatures at bay. I don't know if any of you have been with any of my previous talks. I have my own personal little werewolf. Now, right now, he's sleeping contently, surrounded by his minions, which are his stuffed animals. I forewarn you, if a siren goes near our neighborhood or comes into our neighborhood, my dog will probably be howling in the background. We'll just ignore it while he does it. He doesn't do it for too long, but he really just can't fight that urge. My little dog just loves to howl whenever he hears a siren. Back to moon lore. So September, you've got a couple different names attached to the moons. And the names I'm focusing on mainly are going to be coming from your Native American cultural groups or your European cultural groups. Those of you living on the coast are probably aware we're still in our hatching season for sea turtles. So oftentimes this is known as the turtle moon because people were seeing the turtles hatching and going to the ocean this time of the year. It's also known as the corn moon because you are going to see corn still being harvested this time of the year. And again, it can be called the harvest moon depending on if it's close to the fall equinox. October, again, harvest moon, but it also can be known as the blood moon or winter is coming moon. And then finally, November's moon could be known as the beaver moon, the dark moon, deer sheds their antlers moon, or the fog moon. Now, the fog moon is more of a West Coast Native American name attached, and it has to do with Fog Woman and the Raven myth. And if you ever have a chance, I highly recommend you read that, that tale. It's fascinating. Fog Woman was considered a beneficial woman to an extent. And it's an interesting, if you love learning about moon lore and Native American cultural stories, I really am going to push you in that direction. Now, as far as plants, the plants that I'm going to be talking about today, some of us are very familiar with. We're going to be talking about apples, wild strawberries, marigolds. I'm then going to be talking about plants we may not be as familiar with in our gardens in the sense of, for instance, asters. Most people just probably have those in their garden because they look pretty and they grow well in the fall. But asters have a pretty interesting history. Broom corn. Most people really don't think about broom corn today nor know about it. And also pumpkins and turnips. I'm not really going to be talking about pumpkins and turnips in a culinary sense. I think we all know what to do with a pumpkin or a turnip. So I'm going to be talking about their history as far as how we would have used them culturally outside of the kitchen. Now, first up is apples, and outside of the sour crab apples, apples are not native to America. They were brought over to Europe, or brought over from Europe, and apples were grown from their seeds originally. They were not grafting apples. At one point in Americans' history, there were a wide range of apple breeds. It just is amazing when you see how many types of apples were being grown in this country. And they were being grown for different uses. You have apples that are being grown for cider, which is, in all fairness, the most popular reason you're going to be growing an apple. Cider was the most popular beverage of choice when it came to something that's fermented, followed by beer and wine. Whiskey, bourbon, they're a little further down because they may not be able to, you may not have access to them as readily as wine, beer, and cider. We tend to today think that everyone drank water in the past. You did not. You weren't aware of boiling water is what is going to render it safe to drink. People did not know during this time period that when they were boiling their water for coffee or tea, that's why it was a healthy beverage. They assumed it was the tea or coffee being added into it, which is why you could drink your water. Same with your beer and your cider, you're fermenting. So it's basically killing off anything in that water that might be causing, at the least, a rumbly tummy. We see cider kind of fall by the wayside later on with Prohibition, and it's really kind of seen a resurgence in the last couple years. I don't really want to use the term hipsters, but with the craft beer, American wineries coming up and going, and then your craft ciders coming up and about, you're seeing, luckily, because of this, a lot of these heritage apples that had almost disappeared, some sadly have disappeared, coming back into trend and being produced again. And that is because you either had families that had that one lone apple tree still surviving on their property, or you even hear of folks that were proud of this rare apple that they grew and just kept cultivating and kept growing it without realizing that it was a significant plant that they had in their yard because they were the only person that had that breed of apple left. If you ever have a chance, I highly recommend that you go to Clemens, North Carolina. Over there, we've got Tom Brown with Heritage Apples, and this man is amazing. He's a retired chemical engineer. I've been lucky enough to go to a fall festival where he was at, and it is amazing. He is scoured North Carolina. He's found so many breeds that were thought to be lost, and he's cultivating them, and he's getting these apples back up and going. And whenever you can go to a festival, I know with COVID restrictions, it's a bit difficult right now, but if you can go and he's there, it's amazing because the apples that he has and just the wide range of textures and flavors, it's phenomenal. We tend to, when we think of apples, just think of the ones we get at the grocery store, but they are a truly amazing fruit. Now, I've been talking about cider apples. That's not to say you didn't also grow apples for eating. Most of the time when you're going to be eating them, you're going to be cooking them or baking them. In fact, we have a really fun recipe at the end of this lecture that we'll go over. You can also see them preserving apples. Apples that were bred that had a lower moisture content and a thicker skin, you're going to store in maybe baskets down in your cellar, and they could stay down in there for a pretty long time. They may shrivel, they may dry up a bit, and oftentimes with that, you're going to reconstitute them either in boiling water or hot liquor. You can also see them making apple brandy, which for most people, it's going to be you take a big jug, pour it with brandy, put your apples down in there, maybe a form of simple syrup, or if you've got your hands on honey, you'll use that as a sweetener, and just let them kind of sit in there. You can either then see folks straining out the apples later on and just keeping the liquid. Commonly though, you're going to take those preserved apples out, slice them up and use them for making pies and other types of desserts. Another way of preserving your apples, especially those that again have the lower moisture content to them, is you're going to cut them up and cut them in pretty big chunks and then string them up on any type of twine that you had, tying a knot in between so that they're not touching. They're kind of separated, air can get through. And then these can typically be hung in your kitchen. And the reason you're going to hang them in your kitchen is because you have that dry air from your fire. And it's a perfect space for just hanging things to dry. Check on them once in a while. Once they've dried out fully, you could always then put them in a sack and set them off to the side where they're still going to get some airflow, but you're not worried about them at this point having any type of moisture to cause issues. Now, with apples, we're going to stay in the fruit family. And the next thing we're going to be talking about is strawberries. And these are wild strawberries. You can find wild strawberries growing in your yard. You can also find Indian mock strawberries growing in your yard. And there is a difference between the two. You can eat Indian mock strawberries. They don't have too much of a flavor. In fact, I have a photo of one later on that we'll be seeing. There's no sign of it being toxic. It's just, it tends to be a low runner on your ground. And if you have pets like I do, you may want to be a little wary of eating those if they're out and about in the yard. Again, they don't really have much of a flavor. The mock strawberry has yellow flowers, whereas your wild strawberry that has very bright, amazing flavor has a white flower. And it tends to, whereas the mock strawberry, you'll see the little bud facing upright, or I should say the fruit itself facing upright towards the sun. Your real strawberry, your wild strawberry, they're going to hang down off a stem, usually away from the sun. And color-wise, they're the same, the fruit itself. It's not technically a berry, but we're not going to get into that during this talk. They were very popular by the early colonists when they came over here, and it was also a very popular eating fruit with the Native American people. Now, strawberries were discovered as early as the 1600s and were being sent back over to Europe. In fact, they believe it was in 1588 that you'd first see strawberries kind of being mentioned in this country. By the 1750s, they are in Brittany, France. They are taking 2 American breeds of strawberry to create the garden strawberry that we know and love today. And basically, they're taking a breed from North America and a breed down from Central and South America and merging the two. The early strawberries, again, like a lot of your earlier fruits and vegetables when they're being cultivated, they're going to look a little different than the ones we have today. They're probably not as large as what we're used to. You know this, you buy strawberries, they're a tender fruit. They're not like apples that can take a bit of abuse, not a lot of abuse, but they can take a little more abuse than your strawberry can. So unless you were lucky enough to live somewhere where you could go and harvest wild strawberries, or if, and you do see this in colonial gardens up and down the eastern seaboard, even interior part of North Carolina, growing it in pots, you had your chance of eating strawberries. If you're going to be eating the cultivated ones that are coming out of France, it's a little harder. Those are typically going to be strawberries eaten by the wealthy. In fact, strawberries being eaten by the wealthy are going to work their way into American politics. Martin Van Buren was basically accused by his Whig opponents of enjoying too much French cuisine, including the strawberry, compared to William Henry Harrison, who won for president, eating a very simple meal of basically cured meats, very little salt, if any salt whatsoever. In fact, it was often eating raw beef without salt. I'm not so sure about that. But that aside, it's interesting to see that a fruit we probably don't really look at much in the grocery store of having a political history or even a cultural history was a very popular and very problematic sometimes fruit. Marie Antoinette was even sometimes with the eat cake, all that, accused of enjoying strawberries way too much. They could be seen sometime as an aphrodisiac. we're going to keep this PC, so I'm not going to go into that realm. But you also see the leaves of strawberries being used as an astringent or a tonic for skin problems, ranging from eczema to rashes. It was even believed to help with keeping a young woman's skin nice and fair, which up until more modern times was kind of the common look for young ladies, to have that nice pale skin. From strawberries, we're going to work our way into asters. And I'm sorry if I'm moving a little quickly through the fruits, but as I mentioned at the beginning, I've got a lot to get through for our fall talk. So I'm trying to keep it shifting along at a pretty easy pace. Now, asters, and we'll have a photo of those at the end too if you're not familiar with them, are a beautiful plant to have in your garden this time of the year. It's an important plant to have too because it can be a late season pollinating flower for your bees and other native pollinators that are looking basically to get as much food as possible before the first frost comes in. It is a plant that throughout history was considered to be beloved by the gods, whether it's pagan gods or later on Christian gods. And it has to do with the fact that it has a beautiful open face. And for many, they thought of stars, a smattering of little stars across the lawn, wherever it grew, especially if you're using, or planting, I should say, the white aster. Because of that, we do see it being used for worship with pagan shrines, and we also see it working its way into the Christian church. It is a flower sometimes associated with the Virgin Mary. The plant itself it has an interesting botany history. In the 1990s, they started reclassifying the aster flower family, and I'm not going to get into that either, but there are native species to America, just like you'll see some over in Europe and Asia. They are in the daisy family. So when you look at one, a lot of times those who are not familiar with asters may immediately say, oh, it's some type of daisy. It is a plant that has an interesting history when you delve a little deeper. In medieval Europe, people had a fear of snakes, whether they were venomous or not, sadly. And one of the ways of keeping snakes away from your home was to take aster roots, bruise them or crush them up somehow, and then scatter it around your perimeter. And supposedly snakes just couldn't stand aster roots, and they would steer clear of your home. We also see with beekeeping, if your bees look to be ill, depressed, bee lore is absolutely fascinating. And if you look at it, you'll realize that the bees and their human keepers had an amazing connection. And so you would have kept an eye on your bees and what health they seem to be in, just like any other farmer would with his livestock, or a family member would with someone in their household. They believe that you could take the petals and crush those up and feed them to an injured or sick bee. Now, I saw something interesting recently, a thesis by a student, I can't remember, I think she was in Germany, where she was wondering if what they were actually doing when they, not aware, is by taking these flowers, they were actually putting the pollen at a more accessible location for bees that may not have been feeling well. Perhaps maybe they were cold shocked. And she said, and so by putting these flowers with the pollen right there, and again, this is just her thesis, and she says that she's speculating, perhaps it was kind of like giving them basically a little bee IV. You're helping them out a little bit by making them not have to travel to the plants to actually get the pollen. We see the Native American peoples using it for allergies. And in fact, today there's some studies into seeing how it will help with decongestion, with helping relax your lungs, especially if someone suffers from mild to severe asthma. And again, it's a flower that is oftentimes attached to the dead. And that can be because of its star-like appearance. Again, going back into worship with pagan and then Christian gods, it was a popular flower to lay on the grave of someone that you love that had passed. We also will once in a while see records, and these are pretty rare, but they're out there, of folks planting them on a grave in hopes that the star-like look of the flower will help transition that soul to the heavens and to the stars themselves. Now, talking about flowers that are associated to the dead, I'm probably going to talk about what is the most popular flower that we today, not just in America, not just in Central America, but globally think of as a flower that can be used to basically remember your loved ones that have passed. And that is going to be the marigolds. I'm sure if any of you saw the Disney movie Coco, you know what I'm talking about. That flower is prevalent through the whole movie. Marigolds are not just a flower, though, of importance for the dead and basically remembering your loved ones. It is a very important pot herb throughout history. Now, even though it's globally used today, in fact, it's in a very important flower in Indian culture for a lot of their holidays and special events, it's a Native American plant. And it basically, the species I'm going to be talking about is cultivated down in Central America. It is, and I've got a picture of it later on from one in my garden. It's that beautiful, bright, orangey, golden colored flower. It almost like you have a bunch of little suns in amongst your garden whenever you plant them. And the reason I'm using the term pot herb is because it is one of your wild plants that you can put in a pot and it does well. We see people growing marigolds throughout the year by keeping them in pots. And when it became too cold for them to be outside, perhaps bringing them into their sheds or in their kitchens or anywhere they could bring them in where they're going to be protected from the elements, but still survive throughout the wintertime. Marigolds are edible, and I encourage you, if you ever get a chance, to grow some, keep them in a protected area where you do not have to worry about wildlife or pets getting to them. And that way you don't have to clean them quite as heartily as if you were picking them from outside. But the petals themselves have this wonderful herbaceous, spicy flavor. They're excellent as a garnish on any type of meat you've just roasted. They're excellent in salads. And they're a very healthy flower to actually incorporate into your diet. It was also an important plant because it can be used for dyeing fabric, and you do get a beautiful color. Of course, you're going to have to grow quite a few marigolds to produce enough dye, but you would see people, especially those that are dyeing fabric, having long rows or almost like fields of marigold that they're growing solely for that purpose. Now, back to your Day of the Dead, it was considered to be a spicy scented flower. So those that have passed on, the ghost of your loved ones could smell it, and it would bring them back to our world for one of the most famous holidays of the world, Day of the Dead, so that they could partake of the meal you wish to share with them and to see how the family has moved on, or has it grown since their passing. Marigolds were also considered to be the flower that would help these souls find their way back home. And just like the carnation today, which also has a spicy scent, sadly, some people aren't too keen on this flower. They often see it as a death flower and associate perhaps not the most positive ideas and perhaps they get a little superstitious, we'll just say that. But in all fairness, throughout its history, this is an amazing, amazing plant. And what I love is the fact that it started out as a very important plant to the native cultures over here and has worked its way across the globe to other cultural groups. As far as medicine, we do see it being used for various types of eye disorders, and you do see research going into that today. Also, there is some research into marigolds and how they can help with various types of heart disorders. Now we're going to move on from the marigold to broom corn, which is a plant a lot of us in this country may not have ever heard of, or we perhaps don't think about, because today we don't have to make our own brooms. And that's what broom corn was originally grown for. It was a crop that you could use as a rotating crop. It was believed to be discovered around the 1500s in Italy. Benjamin Franklin actually brought the plant to us here in America in the 1700s. I've had a lucky chance to be able to use broom corn to make a traditional broom, and I can tell you it's a very hardy plant, and once you get it formed, that broom is going to sweep better than any of the modern brooms we have today. And the brooms I'm talking about are not the flat brooms that we're used to today. That's a more modern invention that comes from your shaker community. The brooms that historically would have been used, even if you're not using broom corn, let's say you're using willow twigs or whatever natural material was available. Oops, give me 1 second. I thought I had my laptop charging. Okay, I'm sorry about that. We're back up and going. The broom corn would have, or your brooms, I'm sorry, would have been round and straight down. So whenever you see pictures of witches flying on their brooms, it's going to be that round shaped broom that they're using. It's not going to be the flat one that we tend to get at the stores today. Broom corn, you're not just going to harvest it, slap it on a stick, tie it up and use it. You are going to have to let it dry, and then you're actually going to have to soak the stalks in cold water prior to making the broom to make them more pliable. As far as the handle, it really depended on what type of sturdy wood you had available, and you want it to be something strong to hold up to the work that you're going to be doing around your home. Traditionally, ash is the preferred handle for broom because ash is a very good wood to work with. It's a very strong wood. It also goes way back in our prehistory. I didn't quite add it into the talk, but I decided I was going to talk a little bit about the ash tree just because it does work its way into folklore this time of the year. Again, you do see witches having brooms, although if you look at a lot of older records, sometimes people have them flying whatever they could get in their home. Whether a witch flew with the bristles forward or back, it depends on what part of the country or what European country they came from. And then in America, basically those European settlers where they came from. So today we always tend to think that the bushier part of the broom faced back, but historically, if you look at records, it could go either way. The ash was considered to be a tree of life for a lot of your groups, let's say your Norse. We even see it working its way into Roman lore every once in a while. It was believed to be, and this is ironic, a tree that would keep evil away, which I say it's ironic because witches preferred to use ash as the handle for their broom. So perhaps these are good witches that they are talking about during this time period. If you are going to fly a broom this Halloween, you would have needed a flying ointment. And we actually have a recipe at the end that I'll be giving you. Now, I'm afraid this is not a recipe to try and use. This as an edible recipe. I'm not really going to give you one for making a flying witch's broom, because a witch is going to be using all kinds of nasty herbs that are highly toxic to create a flying ointment. Every plant you can think of, it coming out of a garden that you're told not to touch, is pretty much what they're going to be putting into these ointments. Think of poison ivy. Sumac was popular here in the States. Over in Europe, it's going to be anything within the potato family that was considered to be a poisonous vine. Now, back to brooms being made in your home. Broom corn is also going to be used for whisks or anything you can think of today that you're going to need a stiff bristle. If it's made well, it should last you about a year or two. Your whisks themselves, whenever I've used them in the past, especially at historical sites, people get nervous because it's a bunch of twigs bundled together that I'm whisking up items, and they're like, well, what if a twig breaks off? It just breaks off. There were common occurrences of you using it and then baking, and let's say cutting into a pound cake, and there'd be like a little tiny twig in there. Now, our next plant I'm going to move on into, and we're going to keep with kind of the darker theme, is pumpkins versus turnips. Pumpkins, native to America. Turnips, the turnip I'm going to be talking about is a breed that comes out of Ireland. It's your larger turnip, but you can find turnips in America too. And the reason it's pumpkins versus turnips, I think a lot of you probably know this, over in Ireland, in Europe, you will see them using turnips around Halloween to carve faces in to keep evil spirits at bay or whatever else might be worrying you. Here in the States, we moved on to pumpkins. Now, if you've never seen a carved turnip, it is terrifying. It is not like our pumpkins. Our pumpkins, no matter how grotesque we tend to make them, there's always a bit of cuteness to them. A carved turnip almost looks like there's been some decomposition to the human's face. It's pretty scary. And it's extremely difficult to carve. Last year, I waited too long to get a pumpkin, and so I resorted to getting a turnip to carve for Halloween. Quite a bit of cursing and dulling a knife I was particularly keen on, I finally was able to make a carved turnip. It was terrifying. It was hard work, and I'm going to use a pumpkin again this year. It was small and a nasty little thing, and it looked like I had a shrunken head basically on my mantle for the whole Halloween festival. So if I wanted to scare evil spirits away, I would definitely use a turnip, but I think I'm going to keep with the pumpkin because it carves so much easier. They last a little longer, and I guess I'm not that dark of a person. I prefer a little more cute, I guess, to my my Halloween. Now, why you're keeping these spirits at bay, again, a lot of people don't understand why we're seeing so much folklore this time of the year of marigolds welcoming the souls. Why are all these Day of the Dead festivals? And it's because there was a belief that the fall equinox was this magical, mythical time of the year. And it's a time where basically anything goes, anything can happen. There's no barriers anymore. They all melt down. So whether you believe in any of these beliefs or not, it was considered to be a highly superstitious, highly dangerous time of the year. You will see folks doing all kinds of things to protect their homes, guarding it with lanterns of scary faces carved from either turnips or pumpkins or one. You may see them making various types of concoctions and putting them on the thresholds. You can see them taking brooms and positioning them a certain way. Perhaps you would put it with the bristles up to keep evil spirits away. Some mention putting it down. I think some of you have heard of the tale, if you hear a broom fall, company's coming. It may not necessarily be good company. You will see people oftentimes carving the initials of the wise men into door frames of, let's say, not just their home, but also the barn, and hope that that talisman will keep spirits or anyone wishing to do harm to you and your livestock coming in. Burning a candle was also seen as a way of keeping spirits away at night. Again, we're getting into the darker time of the year. But then you also have groups like those that will be worshiping during the Day of the Dead who saw this as a time to welcome spirits that may not wish to do you harm. And so with those that might be barricading their home, all the way on the other side, you're going to see those that are opening their home on these days. They may open all the doors and windows. They may lay out a tablecloth, often a red tablecloth, if they had one, and put a spread of food down. They may share the food with their loved ones that have passed, or they may not eat the food at all. It may solely be a banquet for those that have passed on. This is my own personal belief. An agrarian society is a very hard society to live through historically. You are busy all the time. You don't really have a moment to yourself like we see in the movies. And if you lose someone during the year, you may not have the time to properly mourn that person. So for me, I almost feel like the reason you see these set times is it was culturally okay for you to step back from what you were doing, which is surviving, and just remember those that have passed, show them that you are still getting by, that you still miss them, but they're still being thought of. It was one of these things, and again, I'm saying it past tense. There's quite a few cultural groups that still celebrate these festivals today. It does seem to be whenever you talk to people that celebrate these events, they have a little more closure than some in America today who really kind of separate life and death. And that also has to do with the fact that in our country, we can separate life and death. Most people go to a hospital when they are very ill. Again, hospitals were not a common feature in history. So oftentimes if someone became sick, you didn't go to a hospital, and a lot of times you really didn't even want to call a doctor. You didn't trust them. So you stayed at home and your loved ones took care of you. And your loved ones were usually the ones preparing the body if you did pass. Now, I mentioned asters earlier. An interesting thing about asters is even though you see them burying them on top of a grave, you are not ever, ever supposed to put them underneath the body when you are preparing the body for burial. And you keep that broom away from the body also. There's many groups that say you're not allowed to sweep around or underneath the body, because basically you could be disturbing the soul that is preparing to leave that humanly vessel. Now, I've gotten to the point in my talk where we're going to go over our recipes and craft projects. And at the end, I will have time for questions if anyone is interested. Okay, so the first recipe is fried apples, and I went with a German version of this recipe, but you also see fried apples being popular in England, France, Spain, Italy, and then of course, once they bring apples over here to the States, in America. You do not have to core and cut the apple slices in a round like you see in this demonstration, or excuse me, on this photo, but you can. Especially since apple cores today are really great things compared to some of the older forms that I've used in the past. What you mainly want to do, whether you slice or cut into wedges your apples, is make sure they're not too thin. You don't want them to disintegrate later on when you're cooking them. Your batter and this is an old recipe, so you may need to tweak it a bit in your household, is going to be 5 tablespoons of flour, and that's going to be all-purpose flour, 1 teaspoon of sugar, 1 tablespoon of melted pork lard or butter, and basically you're making like I put down a pancake batter, but in all fairness, you kind of want this to be more like a waffle batter, so a little thicker. And if you find it's too thick, then you can always add in either a little bit of milk or water to thin the batter out. You need it though to adhere to the apple. So you don't want it so runny that when you dip it into the batter and pull it off, all of it comes off. In a relatively deep pan, you can then get fried lard or fry up your lard or butter. I prefer this, I will say, with lard. I know people today are very worried about lard in their health, and especially butter. So if you want to use vegetable oil, go ahead and use vegetable oil. You're just going to fry these up until they're nice and crispy. Because apples do not need to be cooked, you do not have to over fry these, or even you can saute them in a pan if you don't want to fry them, but you don't have to worry about cooking the inside of the apple. When they're done, you can either put them on a drying rack with paper towels underneath and then sprinkle them with cinnamon and sugar or powdered sugar, or you can put them down into a bag, kind of like if you're making your own little donuts at home, and shake them up in there. I've done this recipe both on a modern stovetop, and I have done this using hearth techniques. With hearth techniques, you're going to want to use what we tend to call a spider pan today. You're going to want to get a heaping pile of hot coals underneath that pan, check it by splattering it with water to see how hot it is, and you're going to make sure your fire is still producing enough hot coals that as they cool down, you can replenish it, because you want to keep this a relatively hot skillet while frying these up. And this is one of these items, they're best eaten that day. They get soggy pretty quickly, so I would recommend starting out making a small batch and then moving on to making maybe a larger batch if you're feeding more people. All right, next recipe. Pumpkins. So I'm sorry, we could not talk about fall and not have a pumpkin recipe. And yes, pumpkins were sometimes spelled P-O-M instead of P-U-M like we're used to today. What type of pumpkin you want to use, it's up to you. If you want to try some of the more heirloom breeds that are becoming available, definitely try those. But basically, you want to take your pumpkin and cook it. Whether you stew and strain it by putting it in the oven with a thin amount or a very low amount of water in a pan, you can also, and I've done this, especially if you're in a modern kitchen, put that pumpkin in a casserole dish with a little bit of water and zap it in the microwave. And basically you're doing that until, and you've cut it in half or quartered it, you can pierce it easily with a fork and then strain and carve it out. You're going to add 3 pints of cream. If you don't want to use cream, you can use half and half. You can also use whole milk, whichever you prefer. 9 beaten eggs. So this is going to be more of a traditional custard than a pie we think of today, even though pumpkin pies are in the custard family. Sugar to taste, mace, which is the outer covering of your nutmeg. If you enjoy pickles, typically mace is a flavoring agent in that. Grated nutmeg to taste again. And typically with the ginger, you can see them going as much as what we would call a 1/4 cup of ginger added in, whether it's powdered or you're using ginger root. With the dough, you're going to basically spread it into the pot bottom, and you're just making a basic pie crust with this recipe. You're then doing something we typically don't do with our pumpkin pies today, and you're going to do a lattice on top of it. We tend to only do lattices on top of cherry pies, but with your pumpkin pie, do the lattice, and then you're going to bake it until basically it is set. And if you've never made a pumpkin pie before, it's not set in the sense that you jiggle it and nothing moves. You want to jiggle it and still have some movement to it. It's okay if it's a tiny bit runny, just you're baking it to make sure those eggs are cooked up. If you're using a bake kettle, which is a Dutch oven with legs on the bottom and an indented lid on top, you're going to shovel hot coals underneath it and hot coals on top, and just keep doing that until, again, it sets. And I cannot give you a time, because the problem with hearth cooking is really it just depends on your supply of hot coals a lot of the time. All right, next recipe. Flying ointment. I promised you I was making one. So the flying ointment that I have is excellent on breadsticks, baguettes, pretzels. It is 1 stick of softened butter, pinch of salt and pepper, minced parsley, dill, fennel, and if you have those marigolds handy, some marigold petals to taste. You're just going to blend this all together and then put it in the fridge to firm up a little. If you want to put it on baguettes, I highly recommend not putting the marigold petals in yet. First, smearing it on the baguettes that are cut in half when it's still soft. Put it in the oven for a little bit, bring it out, and then sprinkle the marigold petals on top of it. That makes for not only a great presentation, it's just really tasty. Earlier, I had mentioned the fact that flying ointments were highly toxic. The reason I kind of held back on telling you what all was in it was because you have a common ingredient in your flying ointment, poison hemlock, which ironically, both parsley and fennel are in the same family. Do not ever, ever, ever play with poison hemlock. It is very nasty. You also see various types of toxic mushrooms being used in flying ointments too. Again, I recommend you use this recipe. I think the only issue you're going to have is if you're allergic to any of the herbs that I've got mentioned. All right, next screen, which is going to be into the craft projects. All right, so the craft projects this year for this course are a little different compared to ones I've done for the past. And it's basically getting your garden ready for the winter and creating habitats and homes for the little critters that are living in your yard right now. And what I've got right here that I've created at one part of my garden is it's a cross between a stumpery and a rookery. With all the green right now, it's kind of hard to see the stumps in there, but what I've created with this little baby ecosystem is a happy habitat for the good bugs that I want to live in my garden. It's a home for the non-venomous snakes that I also want in my garden, and for the lizards. In fact, sadly, none were in this photo when I took it, but most of the time when I walk by, the king snake that lives in my front yard likes to be coiled up on that one stump. And I've also noticed this home seems to be a perfect habitat for ladybugs. And the dragonflies in my garden love to land on all that grass that I've got in there before they fly off. And because of that, I have not really this summer had a problem with biting flies or mosquitoes in my yard. So I'm really quite happy with this little habitat that I've created. Next slide. So here's another, if you don't want to go that drastic, thing you can do to create a habitat in your yard for creatures is just to take some down limbs and then just put them somewhere away from your house where you don't have to worry about attracting, because they will to an extent attract maybe some of those critters you don't want in your yard. Maybe like mice, termites, things like that. This is a little wild section of my yard that I have towards the front. I've noticed the bunnies seem to like this area. I've got squirrels back in there. Young possum will come in and out of there once in a while. But again, I've seen the snake, or it could be another snake, who knows, that likes being up on that. But it's creating a habitat for a lot of your bugs that you do want in your yard to have shelter this winter time. All right, next photo. Water source throughout winter is pretty important for birds and other critters. I had a bird bath, which you can see the bottom part break this year. I lost the center part that looked like a stump. So I just put it on the ground, and then I took 2 pots, glued them together, took another tiny little bird bath piece, glued that on top, and made basically a tiered water station for small birds and other animals in the garden. And no, that's not a real tortoise. That's Timmy the turtle that lives in my rock garden. I have seen birds using it. The reason I have the larger rocks within is it's basically just to kind of keep it weighted, because I've noticed the very, very healthy doves like to kind of ram into it, and they knocked it over twice. So the rocks seem to be helping. Next slide. And what you're seeing here is a garden I have taken 3 years to let go wild. And I know a lot of people scream when I mention just let it go. You can prune, you can trim. I've got native and non-native species growing in this, including all the way to the right where I've got that kind of, it looks like a little silver fern. That's actually wormwood. I've got wild birdseed millet growing, which the birds will be eating once it starts putting off seed in a little bit. I have not in this garden had a single issue this entire year with anything that would cause problems. I've had no aphids in this garden. I've had, ironically, even though I live near the marsh, mice stay clear of it because I've let spearmint grow wild. Yes, it's a bit crazy, but I love the spearmint and I can keep it at bay. On the left, I do have Mexican pansy growing a little crazy, but again, I can trim that up and keep it in place. And I've just noticed with this garden, it is extremely healthy. There's enough light and airflow to get through. I've not had to do anything but get in there once in a while. I do take a large stick and knock it around a little just to make sure there's no water moccasins, because it is near a water spot. But once I'm sure I have no critters kind of hanging out in there, I just get in, do some pruning, and keep it happy. This garden was created after Hurricane Florence. This garden last year was the best garden to survive a hurricane. So that's the other thing I'm noticing by letting it go wild. I think I'm letting the root system become strong enough that it's almost like they're creating a support system for each other during the occasional flooding or high winds that come through. All right, and I think there's one more slide, I think. Or am I done? Oh, yeah. All right, so real quick, mock strawberry. You can eat it, but I don't recommend it. It doesn't really have any flavors. Next slide. That's the marigold we've been talking about. And again, I'm sure you all know what it looks like, but just in case. Next slide. Those are the asters that I've been talking about. I have purple asters in my yard, but white will also work very well. Sadly, these haven't opened 100% yet, but once they do, they have that beautiful yellow center that just entices all kinds of native pollinators. Next slide. Is that it? Oh, we're done. So does anybody have any questions for me? I'm sorry, I know that was an awful lot to cram in 1 hour. Oh, thank you for the very cool and that garden looks happy message.
Desi, this was wonderful, and I mean, I always learn so much about the garden. I feel so much better too since you said you let your garden go wild, because now I can pretend that it's a philosophical choice on my part rather than laziness that my garden is going wild. I think the thing I'm going to take away the most is when you talked about how they were so busy surviving that sometimes during the year they would experience losses and things, and not really have the time to mourn and to reflect on that. And so that by setting aside that time period, it gave people a chance to live with their grief and to mourn and to really get it out. I never thought of it that way, and that was a whole different paradigm. And I'm going to give that some more thought. I really like that. So thank you for that.
Oh, you're welcome. I think that's something that I've done in recent years, and it's kind of helped with kind of dealing with the loss. It's not so much I'm compartmentalizing it, but it's like I can, it's like I'm re-remembering. I'm not forgetting is kind of the way I see it.
And protecting some space around it. Okay, now it's okay for me to really to grieve and to focus on that, and then to move on with the season. So I thought that was incredible. I really want to think about that some more. Somebody, I don't know if you can see, can you? So somebody said, will you send out tips for the garden afterward? And and then somebody else said, I was thinking about witches, brooms, witch hats, cats, symbolism of Halloween. I've heard it's all related to beer brewing, which women used to manage in the old world. So.
That is really cool. I have heard folks mention that. I've actually not had the chance to look into that more, but you are so right. Brewing was considered a woman's, or a job that it was okay for a woman to have. It could be she inherited the brewery. It could be her husband passed on, or they were jointly running it. But yeah, we tend to today, I don't know why I always think of Sam Adams. Not modern Sam Adams, there we go. When I think of beer, and you do see women going into craft brewing, but it's just one of those jobs that sadly we don't talk about. Just like, I hate to say it, but the movie The Knight's Tale, there were women that were working as blacksmiths historically. So as far as the cats, I will say this real quick. It depends on where you come from, what color cat is considered bad luck. Some countries it's white, some it's black, some are calico. There's various thoughts behind it. Reason dogs are sometimes seen as bad is you had Hecate, who was a goddess during ancient Greek and Roman times, who has a slightly darker aspect now, but was kind of considered like a keeper of the crossroads. For the hats, I'm not getting into the hats just because I've seen way too much various thought processes on the hats itself. And then witches, it has to do with, sadly, a lot of times you're going to blame that person that may not make you healthy. And so whether it's going to be a doctor or someone that's practicing as a midwife, sadly, I hate to say this, but I'm going to say it because I'm a woman. I think the women got the short end of the stick a lot of times. But yes, it's if I could do a talk on just that, that would be a lot of fun. Maybe in the future. Like, women do always get the short end of the stick. Bob's like, okay, this meeting's done now.
Does anybody else have any questions or comments?
Desi, at the beginning, you talked about the importance of beer and other alcoholic beverages in colonial times when the water was bad. I've always heard that Benjamin Franklin said that beer is proof that God loves us.
Yes.
And what he meant, of course, is that beverage was available and you did not have to drink the bad
Exactly.
water.
Yes. And if you look historically at beer, there was small beer, which had a lower alcohol content. So you do see people drinking that more regularly because they did not want the side effects. You see it being given to children. There were beers, especially if you go back to like Mesopotamia, that are so thick. The recipes coming out of there in Egypt, it's almost like they are drinking their version of a power shake or smoothie made of wheat grains, and would probably churn our stomach today, but they were getting so many nutrients out of that. And again, they're being hydrated without worrying about dysentery and everything else that can go wrong with water. If anything, again, just being over whatever object you had for using to go to the bathroom for a very long time. Yeah, wine has an interesting history, but beer definitely has a fascinating history.
That sounds like a whole program in and of itself. The other thing you said that I'll take away is this about how they didn't understand that the boiling is what removed the impurities of the water. They thought it was the tea and the coffee, which gives whole new significance to me now when I think about, you know, the tax on tea and dumping it in the ocean, you know, and the protest against that,
Yes.
how significant they thought the tea was. It wasn't just, oh, it's a nice beverage and coffee, that they really thought that that's what was protecting them. So and so then if you think about, if they thought that's what was keeping them safe, and then for the audacity of the government to tax something that was going to keep them safe, I mean, that really is galling. It's like, here, I need this and you're taxing. So I've really, this was very profound. Thank you very much for this. Anybody else? Christmas one in December. And next week, we're going to be doing our second Tuesday talk. And actually, I will be talking during the second Tuesday. Imagine that, I'll be talking during the second Tuesday talk. And we're going to be discussing oral history interviews as we move into the holiday season. People start thinking about family and wanting to capture those memories. So we're going to be talking about tips and techniques for doing effective oral history interviews. So I hope that you all get a lot out of that as well. All right. Anything else? All right. Well, we'll see you soon. Thank you very much, Desi.
Yay! Thank you guys for joining me.
Bye.